Pack your things. This isn't your house anymore. My daughter-in-law said the moment I stepped through the front door, my hospital bracelet still tied around my wrist, and my overnight bag slipping against my hip, as if even it understood I didn't belong there anymore. I remember the smell first, not of antiseptic or medication like the past 4 days, but of lemon polish and something unfamiliar, as if the house had been cleaned for a guest who wasn't me. And I stood there on the welcome mat I had picked out 15 years ago, staring at Vanessa as she crossed her arms like she was guarding something, like I was the intruder, and for a second I thought maybe I had walked into the wrong house. Maybe the anesthesia hadn't fully worn off. Maybe this was some strange delay in my mind catching up to reality. But then I saw Brian behind her, my son, my only child, standing just a few feet back with his hands in his pockets, not meeting my eyes. And that was when the truth settled in, quiet and heavy, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I didn't ask what she meant, not right away, because I could feel the stitches pulling slightly with every breath, and the last thing I wanted was to waste energy on words that had already been decided without me. So I adjusted my grip on the bag, felt the weight of the discharge papers tucked inside, and took one careful step forward into the house that had once echoed with birthday dinners and Christmas mornings and the soft hum of my husband's voice reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. "You should have called before coming back," Vanessa added, her tone calm, almost polite, the way people speak when they think they're being reasonable. And I noticed then that the hallway table had been cleared of my things, the small ceramic bowl where I kept my keys gone, the framed photo of Thomas and me at Niagara Falls replaced with a minimalist vase I had never seen before. Brian shifted slightly but still didn't say anything, and I realized that his silence was louder than anything she could have said, louder than the machines that had beeped steadily beside me in the hospital room, louder than the doctor explaining recovery timelines in careful, measured tones. I had imagined this moment differently. Of course, imagined him helping me up the front steps, maybe carrying my bag, telling me to take it easy, that everything was handled, that I could rest. But instead he stood there like a guest in his own life, watching his mother be turned away from the place she had built from nothing more than a mortgage and a promise. I looked at Vanessa again, really looked this time, at the way her fingers tapped lightly against her arm, impatient, like she had already rehearsed this conversation and I was taking too long to follow the script, and something inside me, something that had been quiet for a very long time, shifted just enough for me to feel it. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask Brian why. I just let a small, steady smile settle on my face, the kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't offer explanation, and I stepped fully into the house, past the threshold they had tried to redraw without me. Because if there was one thing my husband had taught me in all those years, it was this. You don't fight for what's yours by shouting at the door. You walk in like you never left. And you pay attention to everything they hoped you wouldn't notice. I moved slowly through the house, not because I wanted to give her the satisfaction of seeing me struggle, but because every step reminded me that I had only been discharged that morning, that my body was still healing, that I had expected to come home to rest, not to prove I still belonged. And yet I kept walking, past the living room where the couch cushions had been rearranged in a way I would never have done, past the hallway where the soft rug I had chosen years ago had been replaced with something thinner, colder under my feet, and I noticed how quiet it was, not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday afternoon, but the kind of silence that comes when people have already said everything behind your back and are now waiting to see how you will react. I set my bag down gently by the staircase, the same place Thomas used to drop his briefcase every evening, and for a moment I let my fingers rest on the banister, remembering how many times I had stood there watching my son run down those steps as a boy, his laughter filling the house, his voice calling out for me as if I were the center of his world, and I wondered, not for the first time, when that had changed, when my presence had become something to manage instead of something to cherish. "You cannot stay here tonight," Vanessa said from behind me, her tone still even, still controlled, as if she believed that calmness made her right, and I turned slightly, just enough to see her without fully facing her, just enough to keep my balance steady. "The guest room is already being prepared for something else, and it would be better for your recovery if you were somewhere more suitable." She paused on that last word, and I could hear what she meant without her having to say it. Somewhere smaller, somewhere out of the way, somewhere that did not interfere with the life she was building inside these walls, as if I had never been part of them. Brian shifted again, his weight moving from one foot to the other, and I waited, just a second longer than necessary, giving him the space to speak if he wanted to, giving him the chance to remember who I was. But he only cleared his throat softly and looked down at the floor, and that told me everything I needed to know. I nodded once, slowly, as if I were considering her suggestion, as if I were weighing the options she had already decided for me. And then I reached for the edge of the console table by the wall, steadying myself, not because I was about to fall, but because I wanted to feel something solid, something that had not changed, and for a brief second I closed my eyes, not in defeat, but in focus. When I opened them again, I began to notice the details more clearly, the absence of my coat from the hallway closet, the missing pair of shoes I always kept by the door, the slight gap on the wall where a picture frame had once hung, and I realized this had not started today. This had been happening while I was lying in a hospital bed, trusting that my home was waiting for me, trusting that my family was holding things together until I returned. I will only need a little time, I said quietly, my voice steady, measured, the way Thomas used to speak when he had already made up his mind about something important, and Vanessa let out a small breath that might have been relief, mistaking my calm for surrender, mistaking my stillness for weakness. Brian finally looked up at me then, just for a moment, and there was something in his eyes, something uncertain, something almost like regret, but it passed too quickly for me to hold on to, and I did not reach for it. Instead, I picked up my bag again, adjusted the strap over my shoulder, and moved toward the kitchen, because if they were going to redraw the lines of this house, I needed to see exactly how far they had gone. I needed to understand every change, every decision made in my absence. And most importantly, I needed to remember everything, because people reveal more in what they think you will not notice than in anything they are willing to say out loud. And as I stepped into the kitchen, I saw that even the place where I had spent most of my life had been rearranged, the spice rack moved, the kettle replaced, the familiar order disrupted just enough to remind me that someone else had been rewriting the story of this home. And they had done it quietly, patiently, believing that when I came back, I would not have the strength to question it. But they had forgotten something very simple, something I was only just beginning to feel again. I had not come back to ask for permission. I had come back to see the truth. I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, letting my hand rest lightly on the edge of the counter as if I needed the support. But in truth, I was studying everything. The way the cabinets had been reorganized, the familiar glass jars replaced with matching containers I had never bought, the small handwritten labels gone, as if someone had erased not just my presence, but the way I had quietly kept this house running for decades. And I could feel something settling inside me, not anger, not yet, but a slow, steady awareness that this had not been done in a moment of frustration or impulse. This had been planned, measured, and carried out while I was lying in a hospital bed, trusting that home would still be home when I returned. I opened the refrigerator, more out of habit than hunger, and even there I saw it, the careful shift, my usual items pushed to the back, replaced by things I did not recognize, brands I had never chosen, meals prepped in identical containers, efficient but impersonal, like something designed to support a life that did not include me. And I closed the door gently, the quiet click echoing more loudly than it should have. "You really should not be standing that long," Vanessa said, appearing in the doorway, her voice carrying that same controlled concern that sounded helpful on the surface but held no warmth beneath it. And I turned to face her fully this time, not with confrontation, but with attention, because people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. "I will sit in a moment," I replied, my voice even, and I watched the way her eyes flickered briefly to my hands, to the bracelet still circling my wrist, to the bag resting by the chair, calculating something, measuring how much time she had before I became a problem again. Brian walked in behind her, slower this time, and for a brief second our eyes met, and I saw something there, something unsettled, as if he had expected me to break down, to argue, to make this easier for him by turning it into a scene he could dismiss. But I had given him nothing, and that seemed to trouble him more than any protest could have. "We talked about this while you were in the hospital," he said finally, his voice low, careful, like he was choosing each word to avoid stepping on something fragile. About what would be best for you after the surgery, and I nodded slightly, as if I were hearing this for the first time, even though I already knew the truth was hidden somewhere behind those words. Of course you did, I said, and I let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it, just long enough for them to wonder if I knew more than I was saying. Vanessa stepped forward then, taking control of the conversation again, explaining how they had been looking into options, how recovery facilities could provide better care, how this house, this home, might be too much for me now. And I listened, not to the words themselves, but to the rhythm of them, to the way she spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my role was simply to accept it with gratitude. And that was when I understood something important, something that had been forming quietly since the moment I walked through the door. They were not reacting to my condition. They were acting on a plan. I moved toward the sink and poured myself a glass of water, my movements slow but deliberate, giving myself time to think, to connect the small pieces I had been collecting, the missed calls, the short visits, the changes I had noticed but dismissed as stress or distraction, and I saw it now as clearly as if it had been written out in front of me. They had been preparing for this long before I came home, long before I even went into surgery, and whatever they were trying to do, it required me to be absent, to be weak, to be somewhere else. I took a small sip of water, set the glass down, and looked at Brian again, really looked at him, at the man he had become, and for a moment I saw the boy he used to be layered underneath, uncertain, waiting for direction, and I wondered if he even understood the line he had crossed, or if he had simply followed someone else's lead until it was too late to step back. I see, I said quietly, and this time there was something different in my voice, something steadier, something that did not ask for agreement or approval, and I turned slightly away from them, not to retreat, but to give myself a clearer view of the room, of the changes, of the truth they had tried to rearrange without me, because the more I looked, the more I realized that nothing here had been left to chance, and that meant there would be a place where they had made a mistake, a detail they had overlooked, something they believed I would never notice. And as I stood there in my own kitchen, feeling the weight of everything they had done in my absence, I understood that finding that one detail would be the difference between leaving quietly and taking back everything they thought they had already claimed. That night, I did not go upstairs to my bedroom, not because I could not, but because I wanted to see what they would do if they thought I had already accepted my place in this new version of the house. So I settled into the chair by the window in the living room, the same chair Thomas used to sit in every evening with his coffee, and I kept the lamp off, letting the dim light from the hallway spill in just enough for me to watch without being watched. And it did not take long for the house to begin revealing its new rhythm. Vanessa moved through the rooms with quiet confidence, opening drawers without hesitation, rearranging things as if she had memorized every inch of the space, and Brian followed her at a distance, not leading, not questioning, just present in the way someone is when they have decided not to interfere. I listened to their voices, low but not low enough, catching fragments of conversation that floated through the hallway, timelines, schedules, a mention of a meeting later in the week, and once, very clearly, Vanessa said, "We just need a few more days," and something in the way she said it made me still my breath completely. A few more days for what? I leaned back slightly, closing my eyes as if I were resting, but every part of me was awake, replaying everything I had noticed since I walked through the door, the missing items, the shifted furniture, the careful language, and slowly, the pieces began to align into something more solid than suspicion. This was not about concern for my recovery, and it was not about making space for a growing family or simplifying responsibilities. It was about timing, about getting something done before I could fully step back into my own life. I let my hand drift to the side of the chair, tracing the worn fabric where Thomas's arm used to rest, and for a moment the memory came back so clearly that it almost felt like he was still there, reading quietly, occasionally glancing up to ask if I needed anything, always aware of me, always steady, and I remembered the way he handled difficult situations. Never rushing, never reacting out of emotion, always observing first, understanding before acting, and I realized that this was what I needed now, not confrontation, not anger, but patience. The house grew quieter as the evening settled, and eventually I heard Brian's footsteps move toward the staircase, slower than usual, as if he were hesitating, and I wondered if he would come back, if he would say something when it was just the two of us, But he did not. And a moment later, I heard the bedroom door close, leaving Vanessa alone downstairs. She moved into the kitchen, and I could hear the soft clink of dishes, the running water, the small sounds of someone finishing the day. And then there was a pause, a stillness, and I heard her voice again. But this time it was sharper, directed into her phone. Yes, she is back, but it will not change anything. And my fingers tightened slightly against the arm of the chair as I listened. We are still on track. The paperwork is already in motion. I told you, she will not fight it. There was a brief silence, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, she does not even know where to begin. I opened my eyes then, slowly, carefully, not reacting, not moving, just letting those words settle into place with everything else I had seen and heard. And for the first time since I stepped back into this house, I understood the shape of what they were trying to do, not just remove me, but move something forward while I was too weak, too disoriented, too trusting to stop them. I sat there for a long moment after her call ended, the quiet returning like nothing had happened, and I let out a slow breath, not in fear, not in defeat, but in recognition, because there is a difference between being pushed out and being underestimated, and they had chosen the second without realizing what it meant. I adjusted myself in the chair, feeling the pull of the stitches, the reminder that my body needed time, but my mind was already moving ahead, already considering what I needed to do next, who I needed to speak to, what I needed to confirm, and I thought of one name, clear and steady, someone Thomas had trusted with everything important. Someone who would know exactly what had been put in place long before this moment. And as the house settled into sleep around me, I remained awake, not because I could not rest, but because I finally understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of seeing everything exactly as it was. I did not sleep that night, not because of the discomfort from the surgery, though every shift in the chair reminded me of it, but because once you see the truth clearly, your mind does not let you rest. It keeps turning, connecting, asking questions you had never thought to ask before. And by the time the first light came through the window, I already knew what I needed to do. I stood up slowly, careful with each movement, and went to the small cabinet by the hallway, the one Thomas had always kept locked, the one place in the house Vanessa had not touched, not because she respected it, but because she did not know what was inside. The key was exactly where it had always been, taped beneath the bottom edge, hidden in plain sight the way Thomas liked to do things, simple but effective. And when I opened the cabinet, the familiar scent of old paper and cedar greeted me like something steady in a house that no longer felt like mine. I pulled out the folder I was looking for, the one Thomas had handed me years ago with a quiet seriousness I had not fully understood at the time, telling me to keep it safe, telling me it was just in case. And I remembered how I had smiled back then, thinking he was being overly cautious, thinking we had more time, more stability, more certainty than we actually did. I sat down at the dining table, the same table where I had served countless meals, where birthdays had been celebrated and small arguments had been resolved, and I opened the folder slowly, not rushing, letting each page fall into place as I read. The documents were clear, detailed, written in the careful language Thomas had always trusted, outlining ownership, protections, contingencies, and as I moved through them, the shape of his thinking became clear. He had seen something I had not, or perhaps he had simply prepared for possibilities I had chosen to ignore. And there it was, in plain terms, a structure designed to protect me from exactly this kind of situation, from pressure, from manipulation, from being pushed out under the guise of concern. I felt a quiet shift inside me then. Not relief, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when you realize you are not as powerless as someone wants you to believe. I heard movement upstairs, footsteps, the low murmur of voices beginning the day, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back in its cover, my hands steady now in a way they had not been the day before. When Brian came down the stairs, he paused when he saw me sitting there, as if he had not expected me to still be in the house, as if part of him had already moved me out in his mind, and for a brief moment, I saw confusion flicker across his face. "You are up early," he said, his voice uncertain, and I nodded once, folding my hands in front of me. "I have always been an early riser," I replied, and I watched him as he walked into the kitchen, opening cabinets, moving through the space that had once been mine with a familiarity that now felt borrowed rather than earned. Vanessa followed a few minutes later, her expression tightening just slightly when she saw me still there, still composed, still present, and I could almost see the calculation beginning again behind her eyes, adjusting, revising, trying to understand what had changed. "We should talk about arrangements today," she said, her tone firm but measured, and I inclined my head slightly, as if I agreed, as if I were ready to follow the path she had laid out. "Yes," I said quietly, "we should talk." And I let the words settle between us, not as agreement, but as an opening, one that I now understood far better than she did. I picked up the folder, not hiding it, not presenting it, simply holding it as I stood, and I could feel both of them watching me now, waiting, uncertain in a way they had not been before, and I realized that the balance had shifted, not in a dramatic way, not yet, but enough for them to sense that something was no longer moving according to their plan. I walked past them slowly, heading toward the front door, my steps careful but deliberate, and when I reached for my coat, the one I had found neatly folded in a place I would never have left it, I paused just long enough to look back at them, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that came from knowing more than I had the day before. "I have an appointment," I said, my voice steady, and I did not explain further, did not ask for permission, did not offer details, because for the first time since I had returned, I was not reacting to what they were doing, I was moving ahead of it, and as I stepped out of the house into the cool morning air, the sunlight sharp against my eyes, I felt something settle into place inside me, something quiet but unshakable. The understanding that whatever they had started while I was gone, they had done so believing I would not see it. And that was the one mistake they could not take back. I drove slowly, keeping both hands steady on the wheel, not because the roads were difficult, but because my body still reminded me of the surgery with every small movement. And I let that discomfort ground me, let it keep me present as I made my way across town to a place I had not visited in over a year, a modest brick building with a small brass plaque near the entrance that read Harold Whitmore, attorney at law. The same office Thomas had walked into countless times over the years, always returning with that quiet certainty that things had been handled the right way. I parked carefully, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion, the pale tone that had not yet returned to normal, but also something else, something steadier behind my eyes, something that had not been there when I left the hospital. And then I stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, each step measured but deliberate. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her expression softening slightly when she saw me, and she recognized my name before I had to say much, which told me everything I needed to know about how often Thomas had been here, how much trust had been built within these walls. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you," she said, and that caught my attention for just a moment, because I had not called ahead, I had not announced I was coming, and yet somehow, it felt as if this meeting had already been set in motion long before I realized I would need it. Harold stood when I entered his office, older than I remembered, but still carrying himself with that same quiet precision. And when he looked at me, there was no surprise, only a kind of understanding that settled the moment into something solid. "Evelyn," he said, and there was no need for formalities, no need to explain why I was there, because men like Harold do not deal in guesses, they deal in preparation. I sat down across from him, placed the folder gently on his desk, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and then he reached for it, opening it with the familiarity of someone who had likely seen every page before, someone who had helped create it. "I assume something has changed," he said calmly, and I nodded once, keeping my voice steady as I replied, "They are trying to move me out," and I did not need to say more than that. Harold's expression did not shift in shock or anger, only in confirmation, as if a possibility had just become reality, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together as he considered what to say next. "Thomas anticipated pressure," he said after a moment, his tone measured, not necessarily from outside, but from within the family structure, especially in a situation where your health might be used as justification for decisions made without your full consent. I listened carefully, each word fitting into the pattern I had begun to see, and he continued, explaining that the house, the accounts, even certain legal rights had been structured in layers, not just for inheritance, but for protection, specifically in cases where someone might attempt to alter control under the appearance of care or necessity. Nothing can be transferred, sold, or reassigned without your direct, informed authorization, he said, looking at me directly now. And more importantly, any attempt to pressure you into leaving your residence during a period of medical recovery can trigger a review of beneficiary rights. I let that settle, not reacting outwardly, but feeling the weight of it internally, the careful foresight Thomas had put in place, the understanding that love does not prevent conflict, and that protection sometimes needs to exist even among those closest to you. Harold then opened a drawer and removed another document, one I had never seen before, and slid it across the desk toward me. There is also a letter, he said, something he asked me to keep sealed unless it became necessary. And I felt my hand pause just slightly before reaching for it, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that whatever was inside would change how I saw everything that had led to this moment. I unfolded the paper slowly, the handwriting unmistakably Thomas's, steady and familiar, and as my eyes moved across the lines, I could almost hear his voice, calm and certain, explaining why he had made these choices, why he had prepared for a situation where I might be made to feel like I no longer belonged in the place we had built together. And as I finished reading, I placed the letter back on the desk, my hands no longer unsteady. Harold watched me quietly, giving me the space to process, and after a moment, I looked up at him, my voice clear in a way it had not been the day before. "What do we do next?" I asked, and there was no fear in the question now, only direction, and Harold gave a small nod, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment where preparation meets action, and he began to outline the steps, precise, controlled, designed not for confrontation, but for certainty. And as he spoke, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else that day. I was no longer walking into their plan, I was stepping outside of it entirely. I left Harold's office with a clarity I had not felt in a long time, not because the situation had become easier, but because it had finally become defined. And there is a certain kind of strength that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, even if that place is uncomfortable. The afternoon sun felt sharper as I stepped outside, the air cooler than I expected, and for a moment I stood there on the sidewalk, letting everything settle into place, the documents, the letter, the quiet certainty in Harold's voice, and most of all, the realization that Thomas had not simply hoped things would be fine. He had prepared for the possibility that they would not be. I drove back slowly, not rushing, because there was no longer any reason to react to their urgency, no reason to match the pace they had set. And as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something new, a car parked just a little too neatly along the curb, one I did not recognize, and I filed that away without comment, the way I had begun to file everything now. When I stepped inside, the house felt the same as it had that morning, but I was not, and that changed everything. Vanessa was in the living room, speaking quietly on her phone, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she believed things were still moving according to her plan, and Brian was at the dining table, a stack of papers spread out in front of him, his brow slightly furrowed as he read, as if he were trying to understand something that did not quite make sense to him. They both looked up when I entered, and I saw it immediately, the brief flicker of surprise, not because I had returned, but because I had returned without hesitation, without uncertainty, and more importantly, without asking them anything. "You were gone longer than expected," Vanessa said, her voice carefully neutral, and I placed my keys on the table with a soft, deliberate motion. "I had business to take care of," I replied, and I let the words remain exactly what they were, nothing more, nothing less. Brian shifted in his chair, glancing at the papers in front of him before looking back at me, and I noticed then that they were not just any papers, they were forms, official ones, with headings and sections that spoke of transfers, authorizations, and timelines, and I could see where his pen had hovered, where it had pressed down slightly harder in places, as if he had been unsure, but continued anyway. "We were just reviewing some options," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain than it had been that morning, and I nodded once, stepping closer to the table, not to confront, but to observe. "Options can be useful," I said calmly, my gaze moving over the documents without touching them, recognizing enough to understand their intention without needing to read every line. Vanessa ended her call and joined us, her presence tightening the space slightly, and I could feel her watching me more carefully now, measuring my tone, my movements, searching for something that would confirm whether she still held the upper hand. "We want what is best for everyone," she said. And there it was again, that carefully constructed sentence that placed her decisions in the language of concern, and I met her gaze fully this time, not with challenge, but with something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. "Of course you do," I replied, and I let a small pause follow, just long enough to shift the weight of the conversation, just long enough for them to feel that something had changed even if they could not yet name it. I moved past them then, toward the kitchen, setting my bag down in its familiar place, reclaiming a small piece of routine without announcement, and I could sense them watching me, waiting for the moment when I would either agree or resist, but I did neither. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, the same simple action I had taken earlier, but this time it carried a different meaning, not uncertainty, but intention. "We should all sit down this evening," I said, turning slightly so my voice carried clearly, "and go through everything together, properly." And I chose that last word carefully, letting it rest in the air between us. Brian looked at Vanessa, and for the first time since I had returned, I saw hesitation there, not just in him, but in her as well, a subtle shift, a recognition that the path ahead might not be as straightforward as they had believed. I took a small sip of water and set the glass down, my movements unhurried, my presence steady, and as I stood there in the kitchen that had once been the center of my life, I understood something with complete clarity. They had expected me to come back weaker, quieter, easier to move, but what they had not prepared for was the possibility that I would come back paying attention, and that changed the outcome before it had even begun. That evening arrived with a quiet heaviness, the kind that settles into a house before something shifts, and I took my time preparing, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the same steady rhythm I had followed for years, setting 3 glasses on the table, placing them evenly, aligning them with a precision that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with control, because small details matter when everything else is being tested. Brian came in first, his steps slower than usual, his eyes moving from the table to me as if trying to read something he could not quite name, and he sat down without speaking, his hands resting flat against his legs, a posture I recognized from years ago when he had been a boy waiting to be told what he had done wrong. Except now there was no one telling him, only the weight of his own choices settling in. Vanessa entered a moment later, composed as always, her expression carefully neutral, but I noticed the way her gaze lingered on the table, on the extra glass, on the absence of the papers that had been there earlier, and I knew she was adjusting, recalculating, trying to understand what she might have missed. I took my seat across from them, folding my hands lightly in front of me, and for a moment no one spoke, the silence stretching just enough to become uncomfortable, just enough to reveal who would try to fill it first. "We should go over everything now," Vanessa said finally, her voice steady, but there was a slight tightness beneath it, something controlled rather than confident, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the suggestion without agreeing to her terms. "We will," I said calmly, and I reached for the folder I had placed beside me, not opening it yet, simply resting my hand on top of it, letting its presence exist without explanation. Brian's eyes dropped to it immediately, and I saw the flicker of recognition, or perhaps uncertainty, as if he knew that whatever was inside mattered, even if he did not know why. Vanessa's gaze followed, sharper now, more focused, and for the first time since I had returned, I saw a crack in her certainty, small but unmistakable. "What is that?" she asked, her tone controlled, but no longer casual, and I met her eyes without hesitation. Something that should have been part of this conversation from the beginning. I replied, my voice even, not raised, not forced, just clear. I let the silence settle again, longer this time, giving the weight of the moment time to build, giving them space to feel the shift that had already taken place whether they understood it or not. Brian leaned forward slightly, his hands now clasped together, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty growing as the pieces no longer fit the way they had earlier in the day. "Mom," he began, his voice quieter, less certain than before. "We were only trying to make sure you were taken care of," and I nodded slowly, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "I am sure that is how you have explained it," I said gently, and I watched the way he hesitated, the way he searched for something to say next and did not find it. Vanessa straightened slightly, stepping back into control, her voice firmer now. We have already started making arrangements, and it would be easier for everyone if we continued as planned. And there it was, the assumption, the belief that momentum alone would carry her through, that once something had been set in motion, it could not be stopped. I placed my other hand on the folder, steadying it, grounding myself in the knowledge I now carried, and I looked at both of them, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that came from understanding exactly where the line had been drawn. Plans are only effective when they are built on the right foundation, I said quietly, and I let the words settle between us, watching as they tried to interpret them, to place them within the version of events they had created. The house felt different again in that moment, not because anything had changed physically, but because the balance within it had shifted, and I could feel it in the way they sat, in the way they watched me, in the way the certainty they had carried earlier was now giving way to something else, something less stable. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, the sound of the paper soft but unmistakable, and I did not rush, did not speak immediately, allowing the anticipation to build, allowing them to understand that whatever came next would not be something they could redirect or dismiss. And as I looked down at the first page, I knew that this was the moment where everything they had assumed would begin to unravel, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to argue against. The truth laid out clearly, without emotion, without hesitation, exactly as it had been prepared long before any of us realized it would be needed. I turned the first page toward them without rushing, letting the document rest flat on the table where both of them could see it clearly, and I did not point to any specific line, did not explain it yet, because sometimes silence forces people to read more carefully than any explanation ever could, and I watched as Brian leaned forward first, his eyes scanning the text slowly, his expression tightening in small, almost imperceptible ways as he moved from one paragraph to the next, while Vanessa remained still for a moment longer, as if deciding whether or not to engage, as if believing she could maintain control simply by refusing to react. "What is this?" Brian asked quietly, his voice no longer carrying the certainty it had earlier, and I folded my hands again, resting them lightly in front of me. "It is the structure your father put in place," I said, my tone even. "For this house, for everything connected to it, and for situations exactly like this one." I saw the word register in his mind, situations, and I knew he was beginning to understand that this moment had not appeared out of nowhere, that it had been anticipated long before he had chosen to take part in it. Vanessa finally leaned in, her eyes moving quickly across the page, sharper, more focused, and I could see the shift as she reached the section that mattered most, the one Harold had pointed out, the one written in language that left very little room for interpretation. "This does not change anything," she said after a moment, her voice firm, but there was a tension beneath it now, something that had not been there before, and I met her gaze without raising mine. "It changes everything," I replied quietly, and I reached forward, turning to the next page, guiding them through it without touching them, without directing their attention like a teacher, simply allowing the words to do what they were designed to do. Brian read more slowly now, his lips parting slightly as he reached the clause that outlined occupancy rights, the section that made it clear that no transfer, no reassignment, no relocation could take place without my explicit and fully informed consent, and more importantly, that any attempt to pressure or influence that consent during a period of medical recovery would be subject to legal review. "I did not know about this," he said, almost to himself, and I believed him, not because it excused anything, but because it explained the confusion beginning to settle over him, the realization that he had stepped into something without fully understanding its boundaries. Vanessa straightened, her posture tightening as she shifted from reading to responding, her mind already searching for ways around what was in front of her. "These things can be interpreted," she said, her voice controlled, but no longer smooth, "and we were acting in good faith, making arrangements that would benefit everyone." And I let her finish, not interrupting, not correcting, because the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was moving away from certainty and into justification. I turned one more page, slower this time, and rested my finger lightly on a paragraph without pressing down, without drawing attention to it beyond its presence. Read that part carefully, I said, and I waited. Brian leaned closer again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the lines, and I saw the moment it landed, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, the subtle shift in his expression as understanding replaced assumption. If a beneficiary or associated party attempts to remove the primary resident from the property through undue influence during a period of medical vulnerability, he read softly, his voice losing strength as he continued. All related claims to future interest may be subject to suspension or reevaluation. The room grew very still after that, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, not just about the house, but about consequences that extended far beyond it. Vanessa's expression changed then, not completely, but enough, the confidence replaced by something sharper, more calculating, as if she were reassessing the entire situation in real time, weighing what she knew against what she had just discovered. That is a precaution, she said, her tone tightening, not something that applies here. And I let a small pause follow before responding, giving the weight of the moment time to settle fully. Precautions are written for moments when people believe they do not apply, I said calmly, and I watched as both of them absorbed that, not just the words, but the meaning behind them. Brian leaned back slowly in his chair, his hands no longer steady, his earlier certainty replaced by something much quieter, something closer to doubt, and I realized then that the shift I had felt earlier had now taken shape in front of us, visible, undeniable. I closed the folder gently, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed before them. And as I rested my hands on the table once more, I knew that whatever came next would no longer follow the path they had planned, because that path had just been broken, not by force, not by anger, but by something far more difficult to move around, the truth they had never expected to face. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something settling into place after being disturbed, and I could feel it in the way Brian avoided looking directly at me now, in the way Vanessa no longer leaned forward with the same certainty, her posture still composed but no longer relaxed, and for a moment none of us moved, as if the room itself was waiting to see who would decide what happened next. I did not rush to fill that silence, because I had learned something important over the years. People reveal far more in what they do when there are no words left to guide them, and right now, they were both deciding how to respond to a reality they had not prepared for. Brian spoke first, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, not weak, but uncertain in a way that suggested he was finally beginning to understand the weight of what he had stepped into. I did not know it worked like this, he said, and I believed him again, not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed what I had already seen, that he had followed without fully understanding, that he had allowed someone else to define the situation until it became something he could no longer recognize as his own. Vanessa did not respond immediately, and that told me more than any argument could have, because she was not someone who left space without purpose. She was thinking, calculating, measuring the distance between where she had been standing and where she was now, and when she finally spoke, her tone had changed, still controlled, but sharper, more deliberate. These documents do not erase the fact that changes need to be made, she said, choosing her words carefully. And your condition still requires a different kind of environment. And I listened without interruption, because I wanted to hear how far she would go, how she would try to reshape the situation now that the ground beneath her had shifted. I let a small pause settle before responding, not to create tension, but to ensure that when I spoke, there would be no confusion about what I meant. My condition, I said evenly, requires recovery, not removal, and I watched as that distinction landed, simple, clear, and difficult to argue against without exposing the intention behind their actions. Brian exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the conversation had finally reached him, and for a moment he closed his eyes, just briefly, before looking at Vanessa, and in that glance I saw something new, not agreement, not yet, but doubt, and doubt has a way of unraveling certainty faster than anything else. Vanessa noticed it too, I could see it in the way her expression tightened just slightly, the way her focus shifted from me to him and back again, recalibrating, adjusting her approach. We have already started the process, she said, her voice firmer now. as if repetition might restore control, and stopping now would complicate things unnecessarily. And there it was again, the belief that momentum could carry her forward even when the direction had been challenged. I placed my hands flat on the table, not forcefully, just enough to ground the moment, and I looked at both of them, making sure there was no misunderstanding in what came next. Then it will be stopped, I said calmly, and I did not raise my voice, did not add emphasis, because the strength of the statement did not require it. The room went still again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, but decisive, and I could feel the shift settle fully into place. Brian looked at me, really looked at me for the first time since I had walked back into this house, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something closer to recognition, as if he were finally seeing not just his mother, but the person who had built the life he was now standing inside. Vanessa held her composure, but I could see the calculation continuing behind her eyes, searching for another angle, another way to move forward, but the space for that had narrowed, and she knew it. "You are overreacting," she said, quieter now, less certain, and I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement, but in clarity. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I am responding exactly as required." And I let that settle, not as a challenge, but as a conclusion. I reached for the folder and closed it fully, sliding it slightly away from the center of the table, not removing it, but repositioning it, because its purpose in that moment had been fulfilled, and what remained was not about what was written, but about what would happen next. "There will be no more arrangements made without my direct involvement," I continued, my tone even, measured, leaving no space for interpretation. "And there will be no further discussions about me leaving this house." And I let the words stand on their own, without explanation, without apology. Brian nodded slowly, almost instinctively, as if something inside him had already accepted what his mind was still trying to process. And Vanessa did not respond right away, which in itself was an answer. I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple movement, steady and controlled, and I gathered my glass from the table, carrying it back to the kitchen as I had done countless times before, because sometimes the most powerful way to reclaim something is not to announce it, but to continue using it as if it had never been taken from you. And as I rinsed the glass under the sink, I understood that the conversation had not ended everything, but it had ended one thing very clearly. The version of events they had believed would happen no longer existed, and from this point forward, nothing would move without me seeing it first. The house felt different after that conversation, not because anything had been moved back into place, but because the illusion that had been holding everything together had finally been broken. And once something like that cracks, it does not quietly repair itself. It lingers, visible in the way people move, in the way they speak, in the way silence stretches longer than it should. Brian stayed at the table for a while after I stepped into the kitchen, his chair slightly angled as if he had meant to stand but had not yet decided whether he could. And when I returned, I saw him looking at the space where the folder had been, his hands now resting flat against the wood, no longer gripping anything, no longer holding on to certainty. Vanessa had moved to the far side of the room, her posture still composed, but there was a stillness to her now that had not been there before, the kind that comes when control begins to slip, but pride does not allow it to show fully. I did not speak right away, and neither did they, and for a moment we existed in that quiet, not as a family, but as three people standing in the middle of something that had already changed beyond repair. Brian finally stood, the movement slower than usual, and he took a step toward me, stopping just short, as if unsure how close he was allowed to come. "I did not mean for it to go this far," he said, and there was something honest in that, something unpolished, and I looked at him carefully, not searching for excuses, but for understanding. "It went exactly as far as it was allowed to go," I replied gently, not accusing, not raising my voice, simply stating what had already happened. He lowered his gaze, and I could see the weight of that settling in, not all at once, but enough to shift him, enough to make him step back instead of forward. Vanessa turned then, her attention moving fully to him, and I could see the tension between them, not spoken, but present, a line that had not existed before now clearly drawn. "This is not the time to second-guess everything," she said, her voice controlled, but no longer steady. "We made decisions based on what needed to be done," and Brian did not respond immediately, which told me more than any argument could have. I watched him carefully, the way he hesitated, the way his shoulders no longer aligned with hers, and I realized that whatever certainty had brought them to this point was no longer shared. "Maybe we moved too quickly," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, uncertain, and that was enough. Not a reversal, not an apology, but a crack, and cracks have a way of spreading once they appear. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly, the control she had maintained now requiring more effort, and she turned her attention back to me, her gaze sharper, more direct. "This does not change the reality of your situation," she said, and I met her eyes without hesitation, not challenging, not retreating, simply present. "It clarifies it," I replied, my voice even, and I let that stand without elaboration, because there was nothing left to explain. I moved past them then, toward the hallway, not to leave, but to continue, to reclaim the simple act of moving through my own home without hesitation, and I could feel their attention follow me, not stopping me, not questioning me, but watching in a way they had not before, as if they were seeing something different now, something they had not accounted for. I paused at the base of the stairs, resting my hand lightly on the banister, and for a moment I looked up, toward the second floor, toward the room that had been mine for decades, and I felt the distance that had been placed between me and that space, not by walls, but by decisions made in my absence, and I understood that reclaiming it would not be a single moment, but a process, one step at a time. I turned back slightly, just enough for my voice to carry without raising it. "Nothing in this house moves without me from now on," I said calmly, and I did not wait for a response, because I was not asking for agreement. I was stating a boundary, one that had already been supported by everything they had just seen. Brian nodded again, slower this time, more deliberate, and Vanessa did not respond at all, which in itself was an answer. I continued up the stairs then, each step measured, each movement steady, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, and as I reached the top and moved toward the bedroom that had once been mine without question, I understood something with complete clarity. They had tried to rewrite the structure of this house while I was gone, but they had forgotten one simple truth: the foundation had never been theirs to change. I stepped into the bedroom slowly, not because I was unsure of what I would find, but because I already knew it would not feel the same. And there is a quiet kind of preparation that comes with that knowledge, the understanding that what you are about to see will confirm everything you have been piecing together without saying it out loud. The door opened without resistance, but the room beyond it felt unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with intention. The bed neatly made, but not the way I would have done it. The nightstand cleared of the small things that had once marked it as mine. The book I had been reading gone. The lamp replaced with something colder, more modern, as if the room had been reset for someone else entirely. I walked in, taking it in without rushing, letting my eyes move from one detail to the next, not reacting, not correcting, just observing, because every change told me something about how they had approached this, how carefully they had tried to erase me without leaving evidence of it. I reached the dresser and opened the top drawer, and there it was, the absence more noticeable than anything that could have been left behind, my things folded differently, some missing entirely, others pushed to the back as if they no longer belonged in the space they had occupied for years, and I closed the drawer gently, not out of resignation, but out of certainty. This was not temporary. This was not confusion. This was a decision that had been carried out step by step while I was gone. I turned then and walked to the window, resting my hand lightly on the frame, looking out at the yard Thomas and I had cared for together, the same stretch of grass, the same line of trees, unchanged, steady, and I let that steadiness anchor me for a moment before I turned back toward the room. I did not begin putting things back immediately. I did not call out to Brian or Vanessa. I did not announce anything at all. Instead, I walked to the closet, opened the door, and began moving my things one by one, not quickly, not forcefully, but deliberately, placing them where they had always been, restoring order not as an act of defiance, but as a simple continuation of what had always existed. Each movement was small, almost quiet, but together they carried a weight that did not need to be explained. I heard footsteps in the hallway after a while, slower this time, more cautious, and I knew they were standing just outside the door, watching without stepping in, unsure whether to interrupt or wait, and I did not turn to acknowledge them, because this was not something that required an audience. This was something that required consistency. I continued until the room began to feel like mine again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to remind anyone watching that it had never truly stopped being mine in the first place. When I finally stepped back, I let my gaze move across the room once more, taking in the changes that remained and the ones I had already undone, and I understood that this was how it would continue, not in a single moment of confrontation, but in a series of steady corrections, each one restoring something they had tried to remove. I turned then and walked toward the door, stopping just short of it, and without looking directly at them, I spoke, my voice calm, clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. If anything else has been moved, I said, it will be returned. And I let that settle without emphasis, without repetition, because it did not need either. There was a pause behind me, a silence that carried more meaning now than any argument could have, and I stepped past them, moving back into the hallway, down the stairs, and into the kitchen where the light was softer, where the routine of the house had always centered itself. I poured a cup of tea, the same way I had done countless times before, letting the familiar rhythm settle around me. And as I stood there, the quiet no longer felt empty, it felt resolved. I had not raised my voice. I had not forced anything. I had simply stepped back into the space that had always been mine and made it clear, through action rather than argument, that it would remain that way. And in that moment, I understood something that no document, no conversation, no plan could replace. I had not just taken back the house. I had taken back the certainty of who I was within it, and that was something no one could quietly remove again.